The night they handed him his match card at the singles event, James already knew he was going to be the most comfortable person in the room. He just didn't know yet what that was going to cost him. He hadn't been to one of these things before. He was 41 years old, a Finnish carpenter by trade, the kind of man who worked with his hands and thought with the kind of patience that large rooms full of anxious people tend to find unnerving. He'd been single for 2 years, since a quiet dissolution of a 4-year relationship with a woman named Donna, who had wanted children urgently and had eventually found someone who shared the urgency. James had not been able to summon it. He'd felt genuinely sorry about that for both of them, and then he'd gone back to work and tried not to make a project of his own sadness. His friend Kevin had signed him up for the event without technically asking. Kevin was 45, twice divorced, and had the evangelical conviction of someone who had found religion after a long drought. The religion in Kevin's case was structured social gatherings with name tags. He said it had worked for his cousin. He said James just needed to be somewhere other than a garage. James had said he spent most of his time in a shop, not a garage, and there was a meaningful difference. Kevin had said he would pick him up at 7. The event was held at a hotel lounge in the city. Low lighting, warm bar light amber on polished wood, the kind of place that tried to compensate for its own awkwardness with marble countertops. James arrived in a navy shirt that still smelled faintly of cedar from the shop because he'd grabbed it from the back of the wardrobe without inspecting it closely enough. He registered at the door, received a name tag, and what the organizer called a match card, a small envelope, sealed, containing the name of the person he'd been algorithmically paired with for the evening's first structured conversation. He did not open it immediately. He got a drink. He found a position near the wall that gave him sight lines on the room without requiring him to be in the middle of it. Kevin found him within 3 minutes and said, "Open the card." James opened the card. He read the name, Margaret Ellison. He read the age, 49. He folded the card back along its crease and put it in his pocket. Kevin said, "What? How old?" James said, 49. Kevin looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has been failed by his own religion. He said, "They probably made a mistake. You could ask them to..." James said, "I'm going to go find Margaret Ellison." Kevin looked at him. "Just like that?" "She's a person who came to a singles event," James said. "So did I." He picked up his drink. "Which table?" The room was organized around small numbered tables, and he found table 7 near the north wall, beneath a large photograph of the city that no one was looking at. She was already seated. She had brown hair that was mostly brown with the beginning of silver at the temples, cut to just below her jaw. She was wearing a dark green dress and reading the menu with the focused attention of someone who has learned not to fill waiting time with performance. She had her reading glasses on the end of her nose, and she was frowning at the small print the way a person frowns at a document they suspect of being misleading. James sat down across from her. He said, "I think we're 7. She looked up over the glasses. She looked at him with the alert brown eyes of a woman who was measuring something quickly and accurately. She said, "You read the menu already?" "No, I just find out where I'm supposed to be and then I go there." She considered that. She took the glasses off her nose and folded them. She said, "Margaret?" She held out her hand. "James," he said, and shook it. She said, "How old are you?" He said, "of 41. She looked at him with no expression change. She said, "How old did they tell you I was?" 49. "Did you ask to swap?" He said, "No." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because the card said Margaret Ellison and I came here to meet someone. I didn't come here to approve a number." Margaret looked at him with those measuring eyes. She said, "You don't seem like the kind of man who usually comes to these things." "I'm not," he said. "A friend signed me up." "Mine too," she said. "My colleague Susan believes she has a gift for this." "She does not have a gift for this." James said, "Susan put you at 49 and paired you with 41. "Susan put me here at all," Margaret said, with a precision that made it clear she had already decided where the responsibility sat. He laughed. It was a real laugh. She looked slightly surprised by it, and then something in her expression recalibrated. They ordered. The menu was, as she noted, using too many adjectives for things that were essentially potatoes. He said he'd noticed the same problem. She said it was an epidemic at a certain price point. He said the dish he'd chosen was described using 3 different words for the concept of small. She said she'd counted 4 on hers, and one of them was French for no reason. The table next to them was louder. At its center was a man named Brent, who James had clocked from across the room and who was now in the process of making what he clearly believed were charming observations about the event, its participants, and the general concept of hope in middle age. His audience was a woman who was trying to smile graciously and mostly succeeding. His voice had the carrying quality of someone who has never had to consider that rooms have edges. Brent's eyes found their table at some point in the second course, and he leaned toward his own date and said something with enough volume to be clearly intended for neighboring ears. The gist was a joke about the match card system's calibration, specifically something about vintage, which landed with the cruelty of a joke that isn't funny enough to be rude and isn't kind enough to be innocent. James set down his fork. He looked at Margaret. She was looking at the wall with the expression of a woman who has decided that this particular thing is beneath her energy, which was its own kind of dignity, but which James could also see required effort. He looked at Brent. He said in a voice that was entirely moderate, "We can't quite hear the punchline from here. You want to try again, or are we done with that?" The table beside them went quiet. Brent looked at him with the startled expression of a man who had expected the room to carry the joke and found instead that the room had returned it. He said something beginning with, "Hey, man," in the tone of someone preparing to explain that he had been joking. James said, "I know." He looked back at Margaret. He said, "The duck is good." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "It is." They ate. Brent's table quieted and stayed quiet. After dinner, there was a portion of the evening involving a short circuit of brief conversations, 2 minutes at each table, rotating. James went through it with the patience of a man who does not find waiting insulting. He talked to a retired teacher and a woman who sold industrial equipment and a man who built birdhouses as a primary occupation and was extremely knowledgeable about it. He was back at table 7 with 8 minutes before the organizer would call close. Margaret was already there. She had her glasses back on and was looking at something on her phone. Then she looked up when he sat down and put the glasses away. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." He would have stopped eventually. "Eventually," James said, "is longer than necessary." She looked at him. She said, "I've been doing these things for a year and a half. That's the first time anyone sat at my table and did that." "Did what?" "Made it not a problem I had to manage alone." He held her look. He said, "You shouldn't have to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you make?" "You said carpenter?" "Finish carpenter. Custom cabinetry mostly. Built-in staircases. I'm doing a library for a house out in the hills right now." "A real library?" "A floor to ceiling. Client wants it to look like it's been there since the house was built. Quarter sawn, white oak, hand-fitted joinery." Something shifted in her expression. She said, "My father was a woodworker." He said, "What did he make?" "Boxes mostly. Small things." He said, "The bigger the piece, the more room for error, but a box has to be perfect because there's nowhere to hide." James said, "That's correct." She smiled. It was a different smile from the earlier ones. It had something behind it. She said, "I'm a hospital administrator, 31 years. 3 hospitals. I currently run a department of 62 people, and I have 1 plant at home that I keep accidentally overwatering." "Begonia?" James said. She stared at him. "How did you know that?" "It's always a begonia." She laughed. It was generous and unguarded and completely at odds with the careful composure she'd been wearing all evening, and he thought that was probably the version of her that her 62 people almost never got to see. Kevin materialized at the edge of the table with the expression of a man arriving at a scene he'd expected to be managing and finding instead that it had organized itself without him. He said, "James," sorry to interrupt. James said, "This is Margaret. Kevin signed me up for tonight." Margaret looked at Kevin with the bright eyes of a woman who has very quickly identified the responsible party. She said, "Susan signed me up. I imagine they're very proud of themselves." Kevin looked between them. He said, "Yeah," in the voice of someone who has realized he has actually accidentally done something right. The organizer called close. The room began to shift. Margaret put on her coat, which was the color of autumn leaves and looked like it had been chosen with the same care she applied to menus and documents. James said, "Can I walk you to your car?" She said, "I took a car service." He said, "Then to the door." She said, "That's a short walk." He said, "I'm good at short walks." She looked at him. She said, "You don't seem like someone who came here hoping to meet someone." "I came because Kevin is persistent," James said. "But I'm staying because the conversation was interesting." She said, "Was." "Is," he said, correcting himself. She didn't look away. She said, "I live in the city." "You're how far?" 40 minutes. "That's not short." "No," he said, "but the library project is going to take another 3 months. I'm out here 4 days a week." She considered this with the focused arithmetic of a person who administers 62 people and 3 hospitals and has learned that details matter. She said, "The coffee near the site is bad, probably." "Terrible," he said. "I know a place," she said. He said, "When?" She said, "Saturday." "If you want," he said, "I want." She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes for a long moment, and he held it without filling it with anything unnecessary. She said, most men in this room spent tonight trying to seem younger than they are. He said, I'm 41. It's a fine age. I'm not interested in seeming like anything I'm not. She said, I know. She said it like she'd known it since he sat down. That's the thing, James. You sat down. He walked her to the door. Her car was waiting. She got in, and through the window she gave him one last look that was composed and warm and decided all at once. Kevin drove him home in a silence that was unusual for Kevin, and which Kevin eventually broke by saying that Susan owed him $20 because she'd bet against it. James said, against what? Kevin said, I told her the car didn't matter. She said it would. James said, you were right. Kevin drove. He said, she's something. James said, yes. The age thing didn't bother you. No. Kevin was quiet again. Then he said, I don't know why I thought it would. James looked out the window at the city lights giving way to darker roads and said, because you've been going to these things for 3 years and you've been watching the numbers. He paused. The numbers aren't the point. Saturday came. The coffee place was a small shop 4 blocks from the hospital campus with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard that had been partially erased and rewritten several times over. Margaret was there when he arrived, 5 minutes early, with her glasses on and a file open on the table. Not because she was being rude, she said immediately, but because she'd had a situation at the hospital that morning and she was managing the tail end of it. He said, take your time. She said, it'll be 3 minutes. It was 2 minutes. She closed the file, took the glasses off, looked at him across the table. She said, hi. He said, hi. You brought the smell of cedar again, she said. I came from the site. I don't mind it, she said. Then, after a beat, my father smelled like cedar. He let that sit. She ordered her coffee from memory, not from the menu, which meant she had been here before and had a preference already established. He ordered his from the menu because he was new and he was honest about being new. She watched him read the menu and said, number 4. The flat white. He said, you're going to tell me what to order? She said, I'm giving you a recommendation. You can reject it. He ordered the flat white. It was excellent. He told her it was excellent. She said, I know, with a satisfaction that was entirely justified. They talked for 2.5 hours. The chairs were not comfortable. Neither of them mentioned it. She told him about the hospital, about the difference between managing systems and managing people and why the second one was harder. He told her about the library, the client who kept changing her mind about the hardware, the specific challenge of fitting shelving into a room that had settled unevenly over 90 years and now had a floor that sloped 4 degrees. She said, how do you compensate? He said, you read the floor. You don't fight it. You build the shelves true and let the floor be what it is. She looked at him over her coffee cup. She said, and that's a good philosophy. It's just carpentry, he said. No, she said. It isn't. Her phone buzzed twice. She looked at it, made a decision, turned it face down. He noticed but didn't comment. She said, my ex-husband believes that calling twice in a row constitutes urgency. Does it? It constitutes him, she said flatly, which is a different category. He said, what kind of man? She thought about this the way she thought about most things, with a pause that meant she was being accurate rather than rehearsed. She said, the kind who is enormously competent and believes that competence is the same as consideration. He managed everything well. He just never noticed whether the thing he was managing was a project or a person. James said, there's a difference. All the difference, she said. She looked at him steadily. She said, what about you? He told her about Donna. He said it without self-pity because there wasn't any. Just the honest accounting of 2 people who had been good to each other and had wanted different things at different speeds. He said, she's married now. Good man. 2 kids. I ran into them last summer at a farmer's market and we had a perfectly fine 15-minute conversation about tomatoes. Margaret smiled. She said, tomatoes. She's always grown her own, he said. She was very good at it. What weren't you good at? He thought about it. He said, urgency. She needed things to happen quickly and I do things slowly. Not because I'm avoiding them. Because I think the doing matters as much as the done. She said, the finish work. He looked at her. She said, that's what Finnish carpenters do. Everyone else builds the structure. You make it what it's actually going to be. He said, that's exactly right. She said, I've been running hospitals for 31 years, and the hardest thing in every single one of them is getting people to understand that the finish matters. That the last 10% of a thing is what determines whether it works or whether it merely functions. He said, yes. She said, most people don't care about that. He said, no. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the window, the city was doing its Saturday thing, indifferent to either of them. He said, I'd like to see you again. She said, I'd like that too. She said it carefully and directly, the way she said structural things. No ambiguity, no performance. Just the honest result of having read the data. He paid. She protested, then allowed it. She said, "Next time it's mine." "I know," he said. She walked to the door and stopped and turned. She said, "James, for the record, I thought about asking to swap the card." He said, "What stopped you?" She said, "I'd already sat down." She looked at him steadily. "And there you were." He held the door. She walked out into the Saturday. The library took another 14 weeks. He was in the city 4 days a week. Saturday mornings became the fixed point around which the rest of the schedule arranged itself. They had dinner once a week, occasionally twice. She came to the site once on a Thursday and walked through the room slowly with her hands in her coat pockets looking at the shelving. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "The floor slopes." He said, 4 degrees. She said, "The shelves are true." "Always," he said. She looked at the joinery. She ran her finger along a fitted corner. She said, "Your father taught you." "His father taught him," he said. "And so on." She said, "It shows." He looked at her in the library's dusty afternoon light and thought about the match card in his pocket from 6 months ago and thought that the number on it had been the least interesting piece of information available that night. All the interesting information had been sitting across the table wearing reading glasses and frowning at a menu. Margaret's ex-husband called again once in December while James was at her kitchen table eating leftover soup that she had made on Sunday as part of what she called a batch system that he had come to understand was how she took care of herself efficiently. She answered it, had a 3-minute conversation in the other room, and came back and sat down and picked up her spoon. She said, "He wants to know if I'd reconsider." James said, "What did you say?" She said, "I told him I was eating soup with someone, and that the answer was still no." She ate. She said he hoped I was happy. "Are you?" She looked up from the soup. She said, "More than I've been in a long time." "Yes." She said it simply, the way she said accurate things. He said, "Good." She said, "You?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Good," and went back to the soup, and outside it was December and cold, and the kitchen was warm, and there was nothing else that needed to be said about it. The proposal was in the shop. He'd thought about doing it somewhere more elaborate, had considered and rejected several options with the same criteria he applied to joinery. Would it hold? Would it suit the thing it was meant to hold? Would it last? He decided the shop was right because it was where he worked and because she had been in it 3 times now, and each time she had gone around slowly, looking at everything with the same measuring eyes she turned on hospital systems and menus and the lintel question at the granary dinner, and he liked the idea of asking her in a place that was entirely himself. He had made the ring box himself, white oak, fitted joints, no room to hide. She opened it and looked at the ring and then looked at him and said yes before he had quite finished the sentence, with the precision of a woman who had already determined the answer from the available data. They got married in the city, in a room she had helped design the logistics of and he had helped with the joinery on, because those were their respective competencies and neither of them saw the point in pretending otherwise. Her colleague Susan cried, which Margaret found both touching and slightly irritating. Kevin cried, which James found entirely in character. The match card ended up in the back of a drawer in the shop, between a marking gauge and a set of chisels. He found it once, the summer after, and looked at it. Margaret Ellison, 49. He put it back. The number had never been the interesting part. "So here's what I want to know. If someone handed you that match card with a name and an age that didn't fit what you'd expected, what would you have done? Would you have walked to the table or asked to swap? And have you ever met someone where all your assumptions turned out to be beside the point, where the person just made the assumptions irrelevant? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. If this one meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.